So the movement of people also caused environmental, linguistic, meaning the languages, and religious effects. The expansion of trade depended on environmental and technological knowledge. So the increase of deforestation in this area worldwide led to flooding and wood shortages in many areas of the world. Rome and Italy, for example, experienced a serious food shortage that can be connected to soil erosion issues. When you start pulling a lot of trees out of the ground, the soil is going to erode a lot quicker, and it's not going to be as nutritious. It's not going to be able to grow as many crops, especially if you're growing crops over and over and over on the same land. China experienced more floods of their main rivers, and this devastated many of their farmlands, and this had to do with the Grand Canal. If you start straightening out the rivers instead of letting them flow naturally, then you start messing with the environment in a way that you don't even really realize. The river's going to flow much more quickly, so you're killing off a lot of the natural environment that grows in a river, as well as you're going to cause a lot more flooding because the water is rushing a lot faster. From 800 to 1100, the Vikings of Northern Europe adapted to their harsh sea environment by developing ships that were tough enough to sail to and raid England, France, Russia, Italy, and the Byzantine Empire. And they were doing this because they were raiding these areas because they were having a lot of their own environmental issues that were causing them to have to go out and look for goods. They were restricted by natural resources by like mountains to little forests, and so they went raiding. Vikings were also known as Northmen, Norsemen, and Normans. If you are somebody who can trace your roots back to Scotland or Ireland, then you have Viking blood in you. In England and France, they influenced the development of languages and were assimilated over time into mainstream European culture by accepting Christianity. They sailed to and colonized northern France, like Normandy, Russia, Iceland, Greenland, and North America. They settled permanently in all of these places except for North America, actually. And then in Southwest Asia, you had Muslim Arabs domesticating camels, which introduced them to North Africa's Sahara trade network, like we talked about last time. And then in Central Asia, you had nomads like the Mongols, making horsemanship the major characteristic of their civilization. And this still lasts today. Their amazing horsemanship skills were one reason why their armies were so effective against lesser prepared enemies across Asia. And we're going to talk about that more in 3.2. Some migrations had significant environmental impacts, like the Bantu speakers. They started migrating east and south into forested regions from Central Africa, and they carried knowledge of agriculture, animal herding, and metalworking, and they used these skills to change the environments that they encountered. Again, we talked about that a little bit in the last unit, but again, the Polynesian peoples cultivated transplanted foods that they had taken from Southwest Asia, and they were taking it into lands previously uninhabited, like Australia and the Indonesian islands, and they were also taking domesticated animals to these new islands. Some migrations led to the diffusion of languages. Like I said, the Norsemen influenced English and French language development. The Bantu-based languages were prominent in southern and eastern Africa even today. Swahili is actually a Bantu-based language. Latin-based Romance languages diffused across Western Europe, like French, Spanish, and they spread even further after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Similar to the ways religions change as they move, languages often change over time as they spread, and we see the difference in this between the Spanish language and the Portuguese language. Another example of changes to languages as they move through time and across regions is the Arabic-based languages spread across North Africa in this area that were, or this era that were carried by Islamic merchants. Also, religion was spread during this era. Islam. And again, we're going to cover Islam in detail in the next unit, but you just need to know for right now that it modified its customs to fit local belief systems. Like when they encountered Hindus in South Asia, blending of the faiths occurred, and this is reflected in the Sufi branch of Islam. The people of the book is one important example of Islamic syncretism, and it says that Jewish Christians Jews and Christians are mentioned in the Quran as fellow believers in one God, and they should be allowed to maintain their faiths and not be obliged to convert to Islam. Later, Hindus and Buddhists were included in the people of the book, and this was probably because social pressures. If you're surrounded by Hindus, then the religious leaders probably thought it was wise to expand their definition of the people of the book. Christianity changed by incorporating Roman polytheistic beliefs, and one, like for example, Catholic priests wear the black robe with the little white dot. This was something that was carried over actually from the Hellenistic age. This was Egyptian culture, the cult of Osiris and Iris. Those priests wore those things. That's an example of that. And they also adapted to local customs in the Americas when Christians started migrating to North America. Buddhism was split between the Theravada, or the traditional Buddhists, and the Mahayana. The biggest difference between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism is that Mahayana is a salvationist faith, meaning that they can promise some sort of eternal life, whereas Theravada focuses on the life that you're living right now. Cross-cultural exchanges were fostered by the intensification of trade networks. We had a lot of diasporic communities, and a diasporic community is simply a community that has moved, like a cultural community that has moved out of its homeland and is living in an area that is unknown to them. Jews and Christians were living in major trade cities that were outside of the Middle East where their main community was. Muslim communities were living in major trade cities. They were moving to China. They were moving to Europe. They were moving outside of the traditional Muslim world. Sogdian merchants from Persia were traveling the Silk Roads as well. They were a diasporic community, and they had a major contribution of translating religious texts. Zoroastrianism, the Hebrew Bible, they were able to translate these for people living in different communities. Chinese merchants also were moving from China and coming in across the Indian Ocean into the Middle East, into Africa, and into Europe. And what's important to know is that all of these people were moving away from their homelands in order to earn money. And governments were able to aid these people when they did that. The writing of certain interregional travelers illustrate extent and limitations of intercultural knowledge and understanding. Marco Polo is probably the most famous person that you know of that did something like this. He journeyed in the late 13th century with his merchant father and uncle from Venice, Italy, to Southwest Asia along the Silk Roads into East Asia. He was gone for 24 years, and then he later returned to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and he wrote about his travels. His book is called The Travels, but it's also sometimes known as a description of the world. It was widely read throughout Europe, and it was later Christopher Columbus actually used his book as inspiration for his expedition to the east. Ibn Battuta was a Muslim traveler from North Africa who in the early 1300s began a journey that lasted 30 years throughout Dar al-Islam. And this roughly means everywhere Islam is. And this was across Afro-Eurasia, basically. He traveled to West Africa, Muslim Spain, North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, East Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. His journals are very lively. They really describe in detail the sites, the people, the customs of each region that he visited. He was incredibly detailed. He was a very good writer. It's estimated that he traveled about 75,000 miles throughout his 30 years. Some other travelers during this era included Mansa Musa, the king of the wealthy West African kingdom of Mali, who journeyed to Mecca on a Hajj in the 14th century, and on the way he passed through Timbuktu, Gao, and Cairo. It's recorded that he handed out so much gold that he actually caused a spike in inflation in Cairo. And another traveler from China was Xuanzang, and he's just a name that you might need to know. This is Mansa Musa and Islam in Africa. That's a great crash course videos that I would highly encourage that you watch at some point. And we're going to stop this video right